She hired a stranger to survive Valentine's night. Instead, her past walked in carrying proof she had buried for 20 years. Charlotte Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, had stared down hostile investors across polished glass tables high above Manhattan, had built Whitmore Biotech into one of the most respected medical research firms in the country. But on Valentine's night, standing alone in a private dining suite 72 floors above the frozen glow of New York City, she felt 14 again, small, unsteady, and bracing for something she could not control. The skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, lights scattered like fallen stars across the Hudson, but the room itself felt hollow. Too quiet. Too curated. Too careful. The reservation had been arranged discreetly. A respectable companion, vetted and presentable. Someone to sit across from her so the tabloids would stop speculating about why a 34-year-old billionaire CEO always appeared alone at public events. It wasn't romance she wanted. It was insulation. Protection. Control. She adjusted the sleeve of her crimson silk dress, steadying her breathing as the maitre d' approached. "Your guest has arrived, Ms. Whitmore." She expected confidence, charm, tailored perfection. Instead, the door opened and let in Winter. A man stepped inside wearing a navy blazer that had seen more seasons than Manhattan approved of. His shoulders were broad, posture firm but not arrogant, and his expression was not eager. It was restrained. Measured. Behind him stood a little girl in a pale blue coat, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit whose ear had been stitched twice. The sight alone was disorienting. But it wasn't the child that made Charlotte's breath catch. It was the photograph in his hand. He didn't offer a greeting. Didn't smile. He simply walked forward and placed the photo on the white linen tablecloth between them, as if setting down evidence in a courtroom. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked quietly. His voice was not angry. That was what unsettled her most. It carried something deeper, something aged by time. Charlotte's eyes dropped to the photograph. A rusted playground. Peeling red paint. A crooked slide in rural Ohio. A skinny little boy missing his front tooth, grinning despite everything. And beside him, a dark-haired girl with scraped knees and stubborn eyes. Her. The room tilted slightly. The scent of expensive roses on the table suddenly felt suffocating. "Daniel," she whispered before she could stop herself. Daniel Harper. 8 years older now. 38. Stronger. Weathered. And standing in front of her not as the boy she once protected from schoolyard bullies, but as a man carrying something unfinished. "You left," he said, his fingers still resting on the photograph. "But you didn't leave alone." Charlotte's pulse roared in her ears. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, indifferent to the history unfolding beneath it. She hadn't been back to Ohio in 20 years. Hadn't driven past that street. Hadn't allowed herself to remember the house, the shouting, the smell of gasoline that clung to her father's jacket that night. The fire. Her father had woken her in the dark, rushed her into the car before sirens ever sounded. She remembered asking where Daniel was. She remembered being told not to look back. She never did. Until now. "How did you find me?" she managed, though her voice felt detached from her body. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing once at his daughter as if grounding himself. "I didn't come to find you," he replied. "I came because my daughter deserves the truth." The little girl looked up at Charlotte with wide hazel eyes that felt hauntingly familiar. There was no accusation in them. Only curiosity. Charlotte straightened instinctively, slipping into the composure that had built her empire. "I don't understand," she said carefully. Daniel met her gaze fully now. "My mother died in that fire, Charlotte." The words did not explode. They settled, heavy and irreversible. Charlotte had been told it was faulty wiring. An accident. tragic but unavoidable. She had testified that in court at 14, repeating the phrases her father rehearsed with her, desperate not to lose the only parent she had left. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained controlled. Your father walked free of the murder charge because there wasn't enough evidence. Because the only witness who saw him with gasoline didn't speak. Charlotte felt something fracture quietly inside her chest. I was a child, she whispered. So was I, Daniel replied. Silence stretched between them, thick and electric. The skyline outside felt impossibly far away now, like another universe entirely. Daniel's daughter tugged gently at his sleeve. Daddy, she said softly, is she the girl from the picture? He nodded once. Charlotte's hands trembled before she forced them still. She had spent 2 decades outrunning that night, building laboratories, funding burn research, donating anonymously to fire survivor programs, convincing herself she was correcting a tragedy she had no power to stop. But Daniel was standing here telling her she had power. That she always had. Why now? She asked, barely breathing. Daniel's expression shifted, not toward vengeance, but toward urgency. Because your father is up for early release, he said quietly. And the only person who can stop him is you. The hum of Manhattan returned all at once, distant traffic, muted elevator chimes, the faint clink of silverware outside the private room. Life continuing, unaware. Charlotte stared at the photograph again. 2 children on a playground, unaware of the fire that would separate them. One built an empire. The other buried a mother. And now they were face to face on Valentine's night, not as strangers, but as survivors of the same flame. Outside, snow began to fall lightly over the city, soft and deceptive. Inside, Charlotte Whitmore realized her past had not come for revenge. It had come for testimony. And this time, she would have to decide whether she was still the frightened girl in the back seat of her father's car, or the woman powerful enough to finally tell the truth. Because Daniel Harper didn't come for a date. He came for the fire she never confessed. She built her empire on precision and control. But the truth she buried was neither controlled nor precise. For several seconds after Daniel spoke, Charlotte could not feel her hands. The private dining room, once carefully staged for optics and protection, now felt like an interrogation chamber suspended above Manhattan. The roses on the table gave off a heavy, almost cloying sweetness. Outside, snow drifted against the glass in slow, indifferent spirals. Inside, 20 years of silence began to breathe again. She dismissed the restaurant staff with a composed nod that fooled everyone except the man standing in front of her. Daniel remained still, his daughter Lily at his side, the photograph lying between them like an accusation neither of them could take back. Your father's parole hearing is in 3 weeks, Daniel continued, his voice steady but layered with something older than anger. They're reopening character testimony. Good behavior. Rehabilitation. Remorse. Charlotte swallowed. Remorse was not a word she associated with her father. He says he's changed, Daniel said. He says he's found God. The sentence carried no belief. Charlotte lowered herself slowly into the chair across from him. She had faced hostile boards, federal regulators, rooms full of men who doubted her intelligence because of her age and gender. None of that felt as destabilizing as the 8-year-old girl quietly watching her now. Lily's eyes were hazel, almost golden in the warm light. Familiar. Unsettling. You testified it was faulty wiring, Daniel said, not accusing, simply stating fact. You told them you smelled nothing. Saw nothing. Heard nothing. Charlotte's breath caught as memory sharpened like broken glass. She remembered the courtroom. The hard wooden bench beneath her legs that barely reached the floor. Her father's hand squeezing her shoulder before she took the stand. The way he leaned close and whispered, "If you love me, you'll say what we practiced." She had loved him. Or at least, she had needed him. I was 14, she said, her voice quieter now. He told me if I said anything different, they'd take me away. He said they'd put me in foster care. Daniel's jaw tightened for the first time. They did put me in foster care. The words landed without volume, but with force. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She had not allowed herself to think about what happened to Daniel after that night. In her version of survival, she had been the only child in the wreckage. I didn't know, she whispered. Daniel exhaled through his nose, as if releasing something he had carried too long. You didn't ask. The honesty in that sentence was brutal because it was true. After the fire, her father moved them to Chicago. New schools. New names whispered carefully through legal channels. A new beginning built on denial. She had poured herself into academics, into science, into a future so structured and logical that chaos could not follow her there. When her father was later convicted on financial fraud and insurance manipulation charges, she had already distanced herself publicly. She rebuilt her identity meticulously: Charlotte Whitmore, biotech visionary, philanthropist, survivor. But she had never once written to Daniel. Never searched his name. Never returned. Because returning meant admitting that the fire was not an accident. Lily shifted her weight, looking up at her father. Daddy says you used to protect him, she said softly. Charlotte looked at the child, heart tightening. I did, she answered before thinking. She remembered the playground, boys mocking Daniel for his worn shoes, for bringing peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She remembered stepping in front of him without hesitation, fists clenched, daring anyone to push past her. She had once been brave. Then why didn't you protect Grandma? Lily asked, the question innocent and devastating all at once. Daniel inhaled sharply, clearly not expecting that. Charlotte felt the air leave her lungs. Because there was no corporate strategy for that question. No rehearsed testimony. No shield. I was afraid, she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. I was very, very afraid. Lily studied her for a long moment, as children do when measuring sincerity. Then she nodded slightly, as if fear was something she understood. Daniel placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. My wife died 3 years ago, he said, almost as an aside. Cancer. Lily lost her mom before she could remember her voice clearly. Another quiet loss layered between them. I'm not here for money, Daniel continued. I don't want a settlement. I don't want your foundation's donations. I want you to testify honestly at the parole hearing. I want you to say what you saw. What you smelled. What you knew. Charlotte's mind raced ahead to consequences. The Whitmore name in headlines tied to arson and homicide. Investor panic. Stock volatility. Board pressure. Shareholder lawsuits. The fragile ecosystem she had spent decades building could fracture in days. But beneath all that noise was something more personal, a 14-year-old girl standing in a courtroom choosing survival over truth. If she spoke now, she would not just be confronting her father. She would be confronting herself. What if they ask why I waited 20 years, she asked quietly. Daniel's gaze softened just slightly. Then tell them the truth about that too. Silence fell again, but it was different now. Less volatile. More inevitable. Charlotte stood and walked toward the window, staring out at Manhattan glowing beneath the snowfall. From this height, the city looked invincible. Structured. Immune to weakness. She wondered how many other powerful people were standing in glass towers at this very moment, pretending their pasts were not circling back. Behind her, Lily yawned softly, exhaustion overtaking curiosity. Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall. We'll leave, he said. I didn't come to ambush you. I came to give you a choice. Choice. A word she had not associated with that night in 20 years. As they turned toward the door, Charlotte spoke without looking back. "If I testify, it won't just hurt him." Daniel paused. "It will hurt me too." He considered that for a long moment. "The fire already hurt you," he said quietly. "This might finally stop it." The door closed behind them with a soft click. Charlotte remained by the window, watching their figures disappear into the elevator corridor. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, poised, successful, controlled. But beneath the tailored silhouette and billion-dollar reputation was the same girl who once stood in smoke and chose silence. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from her chief legal officer. Reminder: tomorrow's investor call will address the Whitmore legacy article circulating online. We need to stay ahead of narrative risk. Narrative risk. The phrase felt hollow now. Because this was no longer about narrative. It was about truth. And for the first time in 20 years, Charlotte understood that the consequences she feared were not financial collapse or public scandal. The real consequence was realizing she had built her empire on a foundation that still smelled faintly of gasoline. She turned back toward the table and picked up the photograph with careful fingers. 2 children smiling in a world that had not yet burned. And in 3 weeks, she would have to decide whether that girl deserved redemption, or exposure. Because if she chose silence again, Daniel Harper would walk back to Ohio alone. And this time, there would be no excuse left between them. He came to demand the truth. He didn't expect to find the girl he once trusted still hiding behind her success. Charlotte did not sleep that night. Manhattan moved beneath her penthouse windows in restless patterns of headlights and sirens, but inside her apartment everything was unnaturally still. She stood barefoot on cold marble floors long after midnight, the childhood photograph resting against the kitchen counter beside a half-finished glass of water. The city she had conquered suddenly felt unfamiliar, like a set she had memorized without ever belonging to. By morning, she had made a decision she didn't fully understand. Instead of calling her legal team, she asked her assistant to obtain Daniel Harper's temporary address. He was staying in Queens, in a modest short-term rental above a bakery that opened before sunrise. The smell of fresh bread and yeast filled the narrow stairwell as Charlotte climbed it, dressed not in power suits but in a simple wool coat, her hair pulled back without calculation. She had not visited a stranger's apartment in years without security. Daniel opened the door cautiously, clearly not expecting her. For a moment they simply stood there, Manhattan royalty and Ohio resilience separated by a thin doorframe. "I needed to talk," she said quietly. He stepped aside without ceremony. The apartment was small but warm. A couch with a faded blanket. A suitcase half unpacked in the corner. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor coloring in a book, her stuffed rabbit propped against her knee like a companion. Sunlight filtered weakly through lace curtains, dust motes floating in the air like suspended memories. Charlotte felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. Real life. Not curated. Not filtered through PR teams or glass towers. Daniel closed the door behind her. "You don't owe us a visit," he said. "I owe you more than that," she replied. Lily looked up and smiled shyly. "Hi again," she said, as if they were neighbors instead of strangers bound by tragedy. Charlotte knelt beside her, careful, unsure of her place. "What are you drawing?" she asked gently. "A house," Lily answered. "With no smoke." The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Charlotte studied the crayon sketch: bright yellow windows, blue sky, green grass. No flames. No darkness. Daniel watched the interaction quietly, his expression guarded but not closed. "I didn't come to argue," Charlotte said, standing again. "I came to understand." Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded. "Understand what?" "What happened after we left," she said. "After my father took me." Silence settled between them, but this time it was not hostile. It was heavy with memory. Daniel exhaled slowly. After the fire, I stayed with a neighbor for 2 nights. Then the state took over. My mom had no siblings. No savings. Just debt. He paused briefly, eyes flicking toward Lily before continuing. I moved through 3 foster homes before I turned 18. Charlotte felt the words like physical weight. I didn't know, she said again, though it sounded thinner now. No, he agreed. You didn't. There was no accusation in his tone this time. Only fact. He told her about the first foster father who drank too much. About the second family who meant well but never used his name, just called him kid. About learning early that depending on anyone was dangerous. About joining the construction trade because it was the only place where strength counted more than background. Charlotte listened without interruption. For once in her life, she did not strategize her response. She absorbed. And Lily? She asked softly. Daniel's posture shifted, some of the steel leaving his shoulders. Her mom, Megan, was the best part of my life. She believed in second chances. Believed people weren't defined by the worst thing that happened to them. His voice tightened slightly. Cancer didn't care about that. Charlotte felt the quiet devastation beneath the restraint. I'm sorry, she said, and this time the words carried no corporate polish. Lily stood and walked toward Charlotte, holding up her drawing. Do you like it? She asked. It's beautiful, Charlotte answered honestly. You're very talented. Lily studied her with curious intensity. Daddy said you used to be brave. Daniel shifted slightly, uncomfortable. Charlotte met the child's gaze. I used to try, she said. Are you still? Lily asked. The question was not playful. It was precise. Charlotte felt exposed in a way no boardroom had ever managed. Because bravery, she realized, was not about hostile takeovers or medical breakthroughs. It was about telling the truth when it could cost you everything. I'm trying to be, she answered carefully. Daniel stepped closer then, lowering his voice. You don't have to prove anything to her. I know, Charlotte said. I have to prove it to myself. They stood there, inches apart now, the air between them charged not with romance but recognition. 2 children who had survived the same night, grown into adults shaped by different silences. You said you're not here for money, Charlotte said quietly. If I testify, it could reopen everything. Media. Investigation. My father's lawyers will tear me apart. Daniel nodded once. I know. And if I don't, she continued, your daughter grows up believing her grandmother's death didn't matter enough for someone to speak. The truth of that lingered heavily in the small apartment. Lily returned to the floor, humming softly to herself, unaware of the seismic shift building around her. Daniel looked at Charlotte differently now, less as the symbol of what he lost, more as the woman standing in front of him. I used to hate you, he admitted quietly. It was easier than admitting I missed you. The confession startled her. I missed you too, she said before caution could intervene. But I told myself that missing you meant reopening everything. He studied her face for signs of deception and found none. For the first time since walking into that Manhattan restaurant, the tension between them softened, not erased, but altered. You always said you'd protect me, Daniel murmured, almost to himself. Charlotte's throat tightened. I know. And now? He asked. She did not look away. Now I protect the truth. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, shaking the thin windowpanes slightly. The smell of bread intensified as the bakery below began its morning rush. Ordinary life continuing. Daniel nodded slowly, something shifting behind his guarded expression. If you testify, he said, it won't just change the case. I know, she replied. It'll change us. Charlotte felt the weight of that possibility settle between them, heavier than scandal, more fragile than justice. She glanced once more at Lily, drawing houses without smoke, unaware that her future was quietly being negotiated in that room. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Charlotte said. "I'm not ready to," Daniel answered honestly. Their eyes held. "But I am asking," she continued, "for a chance to make it right." Daniel did not respond immediately. He walked toward the window, staring out at the modest Queen Street below. When he finally turned back, the anger that had fueled his arrival in Manhattan was no longer sharp. It had become something more complex. "You have 3 weeks," he said. "After that, we go back to Ohio." Ohio. The place neither of them had truly escaped. Charlotte nodded slowly. As she stepped toward the door, Lily looked up again. "Will you come back?" she asked. Charlotte hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood the weight of promises now. "Yes," she said gently. "I will." And as she descended the narrow stairwell into the cool New York morning, Charlotte realized something had changed. Daniel had come as a stranger carrying a photograph. But the real stranger was the part of herself she had abandoned in that burning house. And if she was going to testify, truly testify, she would have to find that girl again before the hearing did. Because facing her father in court would be difficult. Facing who she used to be would be harder. In Manhattan, she was untouchable. In Ohio, she had been a child who lied. The following Monday, Charlotte stepped into the Whitmore Biotech boardroom wearing composure like armor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Hudson in cold silver light, and 12 executives sat around the long walnut table reviewing projections for the next quarter. On the surface, nothing had changed. The company was expanding clinical trials. Their burn recovery division had just secured federal grants. Investors were optimistic. But Charlotte's pulse carried a different rhythm now. She waited until the financial briefing ended before speaking. "There's something I need to disclose," she said, her voice calm but firmer than usual. "My father's parole hearing is in 3 weeks. I intend to testify." The room stilled. Her chief legal officer leaned forward first. "Testify in what capacity?" "As a witness," she replied. "Regarding the original arson case." The word arson seemed to shift the oxygen in the room. One board member cleared his throat. "Charlotte, that case was closed decades ago." "It was reduced," she corrected. "Not resolved." A wave of carefully controlled alarm passed between them. "This will attach the Whitmore name directly to homicide allegations," another executive said. "The press will revisit everything. Competitors will exploit it. Our valuation could drop overnight." Charlotte absorbed each objection without flinching. They weren't wrong. Every risk they outlined was real. But for the first time in her career, profitability felt smaller than principle. "My name was already attached," she said evenly. "I was just too afraid to look at it." The boardroom silence grew heavier, less corporate, more human. Her legal officer softened slightly. "Are you certain this is necessary?" Charlotte thought of Lily's drawing. Of Daniel's steady voice. Of the smell of gasoline she had pretended never existed. "Yes," she answered simply. By the time the meeting adjourned, the headlines were already drafting themselves in her mind. Billionaire CEO reopens father's arson case. Corporate heir testifies against family. The language would be sharp. Ruthless. Public. As she returned to her office, her mother's name flashed across her phone. She hesitated before answering. "Charlotte," her mother began, her voice tight with contained panic. "I heard from your uncle. Is it true? You're planning to testify?" "Yes." A long exhale on the other end. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly," Charlotte replied quietly. "Your father made mistakes, her mother insisted. But he served his time. Not for murder, Charlotte said, and the word felt final. Her mother's voice cracked. He's still your father. Charlotte stared at the Manhattan skyline as if searching for something solid in it. And Daniel's mother was still his. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. You were just a child, her mother whispered. I know, Charlotte said. But I'm not anymore. She ended the call gently, not in defiance but in resolution. That evening, she drove back to Queens without informing security. The February air was sharp, the city loud and alive around her, but inside her chest something quieter was unfolding, something steadier. Daniel opened the door before she knocked, as if he had sensed her presence. They're not happy, she said simply. He stepped aside to let her in. I figured. Lily was asleep on the couch, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. A lamp cast warm amber light across the small room. They think I'm risking everything, Charlotte continued softly. Daniel watched her carefully. Are you? She considered that. Yes, she admitted. But I'm starting to think everything I built was an attempt to outrun one night. That's not strength. That's avoidance. Daniel leaned back against the wall, arms crossed loosely. You don't owe me redemption. I know, she replied. But I owe myself truth. He studied her face as if recalibrating his understanding of her. You know what scared me most growing up? He asked after a moment. What? That I'd turn into someone who pretended nothing happened. That I'd bury it so deep I'd stop feeling it. Charlotte felt the words settle into her like a mirror. I did that, she admitted. He stepped closer, not confrontational now, just honest. You survived the only way you knew how. And you? She asked. I survived by remembering. Their proximity shifted something subtle but undeniable. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was deeper than attraction. It was recognition. Shared origin. Shared scar. Outside, a siren wailed briefly before fading into distance. Come back to Ohio with us this weekend, Daniel said quietly. See the lot. See what's left. Charlotte hesitated. Ohio was not a business trip. It was not a controlled environment with assistants and prepared statements. It was memory without filters. I haven't been back since the fire, she said. I know. The word held no judgment. I don't know who I am there anymore, she admitted. Daniel's expression softened slightly. Maybe that's the point. She looked at Lily sleeping peacefully on the couch and felt a strange pull, not obligation, not guilt, but possibility. Okay, she said finally. The word felt like stepping off a ledge. As she drove back to Manhattan later that night, skyscrapers rising around her like monuments to ambition, Charlotte felt the internal fracture widening. The CEO and the child were no longer separated by denial. They were colliding. In her penthouse, she opened a drawer she had not touched in years. Inside lay a small metal locket, smoke darkened along one edge. She hadn't remembered packing it the night her father drove them away, but she must have. Inside was a tiny photo of her and Daniel at the playground, arms crossed in mock defiance. She closed the locket slowly. Manhattan had given her power. Precision. Identity. But Ohio had given her origin. And in 3 weeks, those two worlds would collide in a courtroom where she could no longer stand in both. She turned off the lights and stood in darkness for a moment, listening to her own breathing. For 20 years, she had believed strength meant control. Now she was beginning to understand it meant confrontation. And Ohio was waiting. Because the boardroom could question her judgment. But the ashes in Ohio would question her soul. She thought returning would break her. Instead, it showed her what was still worth saving. Ohio in late February did not glitter like Manhattan. It breathed slowly. Fields stretched wide and patient beneath a pale winter sky, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. When Charlotte stepped out of the rental car, boots pressing into gravel just outside the old neighborhood, she felt something inside her chest loosen and tighten at the same time. Nothing looked exactly as she remembered, and yet everything did. The houses were smaller than memory had preserved. The sidewalks narrower. The trees taller. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, giving her space without withdrawing entirely. Lily ran ahead toward the open lot at the end of the street, her laughter cutting cleanly through the cold air. That lot had once held 2 homes. Now it held only grass, thin and winter-worn, stretching across land that still felt marked by absence. Charlotte walked toward it slowly, each step heavier than the last. The wind brushed against her face, sharp and grounding. She tried to summon the polished composure she wore in boardrooms, but it refused to follow her here. "This is where the kitchen window was," Daniel said quietly, pointing toward a patch near the center. "That's where they found her." Charlotte's throat tightened. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember fully, not the edited version she had replayed for years, but the unfiltered truth. The shouting downstairs. The smell that wasn't electrical but chemical. The way her father's hands trembled when he grabbed her coat. The way she had asked about Daniel, and how he had snapped, "He's not your problem." She had believed him. Or at least, she had needed to. "I knew," she whispered, the words carried thinly by the wind. Daniel looked at her, waiting. "I knew something was wrong," she continued. "I smelled it. I saw the red can in the garage earlier that week. But I told myself I was imagining it." Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort. He let the truth breathe. "I chose him," she said finally. "I chose the only parent I had left." "You were 14, Daniel replied. "And you were 12, she said back, her voice breaking. "And you lost everything." Lily knelt in the grass nearby, gathering twigs and pressing them into the soil like tiny flags marking invisible lines. She had no full memory of what happened here, only the story passed down through grief and resilience. Charlotte stepped further into the center of the lot and felt her knees weaken slightly. For years she had funded burn units, trauma counseling programs, survivor networks, all without ever standing in the place that had created the need for them. "I built my company because of this," she said, staring at the ground. "Every burn treatment grant. Every fire recovery center. I thought if I saved enough strangers, it would balance the scale." Daniel's voice softened. "And did it?" She shook her head slowly. "No. Because I never saved you." The wind shifted, brushing against them both. Daniel walked closer now, his boots crunching against frozen grass. He didn't reach for her immediately. He simply stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "I don't need you to save me," he said. "I needed you to stand with me." Charlotte turned toward him then, vulnerability stripping away the final layers of corporate polish. "I'm standing now." He searched her face carefully, measuring not performance but sincerity. What he saw made something inside him exhale. They stood there together, not as CEO and contractor, not as billionaire and single father, but as 2 children who had survived the same night in different ways. Lily ran back toward them, cheeks flushed from the cold. "I built a house," she announced proudly, pointing at the sticks she'd arranged in the dirt. Charlotte crouched down beside her, studying the fragile structure. "It's strong," she said gently. "It won't burn," Lily added matter-of-factly. The certainty in the child's voice struck Charlotte deeper than accusation ever could. That evening, Daniel invited Charlotte to dinner at his modest rental home nearby. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and thyme. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't catered. It was real. Lily insisted on setting the table herself, carefully aligning mismatched plates with earnest concentration. As they ate, conversation drifted naturally, not about courtrooms or headlines, but about school projects, construction mishaps, Charlotte's early experiments in college labs. For the first time since Valentine's night, laughter slipped easily between them. Later, after Lily fell asleep upstairs, Charlotte stood on the back porch with Daniel. The sky above Ohio felt wider than Manhattan's ever had. Stars were visible here, unfiltered and patient. "You don't have to resign from your company," Daniel said quietly. "You can testify without dismantling your whole life." She looked out across the dark field. "If I testify, the board will push for distance. Temporary leave. Maybe permanent. And that scares you?" She considered the question carefully. "It used to," she admitted. "But losing control doesn't scare me anymore. Losing integrity does." Daniel studied her profile in the moonlight, noticing the tension in her shoulders, the quiet resolve beneath it. "You've changed," he said. "I'm trying to," she replied. He hesitated before speaking again. "When I walked into that restaurant, I thought I'd feel vindicated. Angry. Strong. But seeing you," he paused, searching for the right words. "It felt like seeing a version of my own past I never buried." Charlotte turned toward him fully now. "I never stopped thinking about you," she confessed softly. "I just convinced myself that thinking wasn't the same as responsibility." The space between them narrowed, not with urgency but with understanding. Daniel reached for her hand slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His grip was steady, calloused from years of manual labor, grounding in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "I don't know what this is," he said honestly. "Neither do I," she replied. "But it's not revenge anymore." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Inside the house, a clock ticked steadily, time moving forward without pause. Tomorrow, she would draft her official testimony. The next day, she would formally notify the board of her temporary resignation during proceedings. In 48 hours, she would stand in a courtroom across from the man who raised her and speak words she had silenced for 2 decades. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "you won't be alone." For the first time in years, the promise didn't feel conditional. Charlotte looked out over the dark Ohio field once more and realized something had shifted quietly but irreversibly. She was no longer returning to face ashes. She was returning to rebuild from them. And as the wind moved softly across the land where 2 houses once stood, Charlotte understood that healing wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a choice. And tomorrow, she would make it publicly. Because the courtroom would decide her father's fate. But tonight, in Ohio, she decided her own. For 20 years, she rehearsed silence. Today, she would rehearse nothing. The courthouse in Franklin County stood in quiet contrast to the glass towers Charlotte was used to, red brick, aging columns, a flag snapping sharply in the late winter wind. The air carried the metallic chill of early morning, and a small cluster of reporters had already gathered near the entrance, cameras poised with anticipatory hunger. Charlotte stepped out of the car without a publicist beside her. No prepared statement. No protective script. Only truth. Daniel stood near the courthouse steps, Lily's small hand wrapped tightly around his. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He simply met her eyes, steady, present. She nodded once. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than memory had preserved. Wooden benches polished by decades of restless hands. Fluorescent lighting humming faintly overhead. The seal of the state mounted behind the judge's bench like a reminder that personal history becomes public record here. Her father sat at the defense table. Older now. Thinner. His once commanding posture slightly curved by time. But his eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, measuring. When he saw her, something flickered across his expression. Not remorse. Control. Charlotte felt 14 again for a fraction of a second, the pressure of his hand on her shoulder, the warning beneath his whisper. If you love me, you'll say what we practiced. She inhaled slowly. The clerk called her name. Charlotte and Whitmore. The sound echoed with more weight than any corporate introduction she had ever received. She walked to the stand without looking at Daniel, without looking at the press bench, without looking back at the life she had built to avoid this moment. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. No rehearsals. No edits. Only memory. The prosecutor began gently. Ms. Whitmore, how old were you on the night of February 12, 20 years ago? 14, she answered, her voice clear despite the tremor she felt inside. And where were you living? On Maple Ridge Drive. Next door to the Harper family. The prosecutor paused. Do you recall smelling gasoline prior to the fire? Charlotte felt the courtroom air thicken. She glanced briefly at her father. His stare hardened. Yes, she said. The word did not shake. I smelled gasoline in our garage earlier that week. I saw a red container in my father's truck. A ripple moved through the room, quiet but undeniable. And on the night of the fire? He woke me up before the smoke alarms went off, she continued. He told me to grab my coat. He didn't call 911 until we were already driving. Her father's attorney stood abruptly. Objection, speculation. The judge overruled calmly. The witness may continue. Charlotte swallowed, steadying her breath. I asked about Daniel, she said. I asked if his family was out. My father told me they weren't my responsibility. Her voice wavered for the first time, not from fear, but from the memory of believing him. The prosecutor stepped closer. At the original trial, you testified the fire was accidental. Why? Charlotte felt every eye in the room on her. Because this was the question that mattered. Because I was afraid, she said. The honesty hung there, unembellished. My father told me if I said anything different, I would lose him too. I had already lost my mother years before. I believed if I told the truth, I'd be alone. Silence fell heavily across the courtroom. She forced herself to look directly at her father now. I was a child, she continued. But I knew something was wrong. And I chose silence. The prosecutor nodded slowly. Why speak now? Charlotte inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of 2 decades settle and lift simultaneously. Because fear doesn't excuse harm, she said. And silence protects the wrong person. Her father leaned forward then, voice sharp despite his attorney's attempt to restrain him. You're being manipulated, he snapped. You always were weak. The judge struck the gavel once, firm and echoing. Charlotte did not flinch. For the first time in her life, his voice did not define her. I'm not here out of anger, she said calmly. I'm here because a woman died. And a boy lost his mother. And my silence helped that happen. Daniel's hand tightened gently around Lily's. The defense attorney attempted to dismantle her credibility, questioning memory gaps, emotional trauma, the influence of media narratives. Charlotte answered steadily. When she did not remember a detail, she said so. When she did, she spoke without hesitation. No embellishment. No vengeance. Just truth. After nearly an hour, the prosecutor finished. Charlotte stepped down from the stand slowly, legs steady but heart pounding with the aftershock of confession. As she passed Daniel on her way back to the bench, their eyes met. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His expression held something quieter, respect. Outside, reporters surged as the hearing adjourned for deliberation. Microphones extended like mechanical arms. Ms. Whitmore, do you regret waiting 20 years? She paused before answering. Yes, she said simply. But I don't regret speaking now. Will this impact Whitmore Biotech? Integrity always impacts something, she replied. That doesn't make it optional. Daniel stepped slightly closer, not to shield her from cameras, but to stand beside her in plain view. By late afternoon, the judge returned with a decision. Early parole denied. Further review into original arson findings reopened. The gavel fell, sealing not just a legal ruling, but a personal one. Charlotte exhaled slowly, a breath she felt she had been holding since she was 14 years old. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the stone steps. Daniel approached her quietly, Lily between them. "You were brave," he said. Charlotte shook her head gently. "No. I was honest." "That's harder," he replied. For a moment, the world around them blurred, reporters, bystanders, history, all fading into background noise. She had expected to feel devastation. Collapse. Consequence. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Lightness. As if the smoke she had carried in her lungs for 20 years had finally cleared. Her phone buzzed with notifications, stock fluctuations, board messages, breaking news alerts. She silenced it. Because for the first time, market response felt secondary. Daniel's voice softened. "What happens now?" Charlotte looked at him, really looked at him, and allowed herself to imagine a future not built on avoidance. "Now," she said quietly, "we rebuild." But rebuilding would not be simple. Not for her company. Not for her family. And not for the fragile connection forming between them. Because truth had freed her. But freedom always comes with consequence. She had faced her father in court. Now she would have to face what came next, without the armor she once hid behind. Justice was served in a courtroom. But love would require a different kind of courage. The media cycle lasted exactly 9 days. 9 days of headlines dissecting Charlotte Whitmore's testimony. 9 days of financial analysts predicting collapse. 9 days of commentators debating morality versus loyalty. Whitmore Biotech stock dipped sharply the morning after the hearing, then steadied by week's end when burn survivor organizations publicly thanked her for funding programs long before the confession. Integrity, it turned out, was not bad for business. But reputation was the least complicated thing she was facing. Charlotte sat alone in her Manhattan office late one evening, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. The board had accepted her temporary leave during the reopened investigation. Officially, it was a strategic pause. Unofficially, it was distance. Her office felt different now, less like a throne room, more like a waiting room. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel, "Lily's science fair is Friday." No pressure. No pressure. She smiled faintly at the understatement. 2 days later, she stood inside a modest elementary school gymnasium in Ohio, fluorescent lights flickering overhead while folding tables displayed baking soda volcanoes and solar system dioramas. Parents chatted in small clusters. The air smelled faintly of poster board glue and cafeteria coffee. Charlotte had not stood in a room like this since she was a child. Lily spotted her first. She came. Lily shouted, abandoning her project long enough to throw her arms around Charlotte's waist. The embrace was spontaneous, unfiltered, and it startled Charlotte more than boardroom hostility ever had. Daniel approached more slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes warm but cautious. "Didn't think Manhattan would survive without you," he said lightly. "It's surviving," she replied. "It always does." They stood beside Lily's project, a carefully constructed model about fire-resistant building materials. Charlotte felt the irony immediately. "I wanted to build houses that don't burn," Lily explained proudly. Charlotte knelt beside her. "That's a powerful goal." Daniel watched the exchange carefully, noticing the ease between them, the absence of pretense. Later, after the science fair ended and Lily ran off to say goodbye to friends, Daniel and Charlotte stepped outside into the early spring dusk. The air carried a hint of thawing earth, winter slowly loosening its grip. "You didn't have to come," Daniel said. "Yes, I did," Charlotte replied gently. They walked toward the parking lot slowly, footsteps unhurried. "The board offered me a permanent step-down," she said after a moment. "Chairwoman instead of CEO. Less visibility. More delegation." Daniel studied her expression. "What do you want?" The question lingered. "For years, I wanted control," she admitted. Control meant safety. But control also meant distance. He nodded slightly, understanding more than she said. "I can run the company without living inside it," she continued. "I don't have to prove myself every second anymore." Daniel stopped walking, turning toward her fully. "This is your world," he said. "New York. The labs. The investors. I don't belong there." Charlotte stepped closer, her voice steady but soft. "You belong wherever you choose to stand." He searched her face for signs of sacrifice, of compromise disguised as romance. "You'd give up your empire?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No. I'd redefine it." The honesty in her tone unsettled him more than grand gestures would have. "Charlotte," he said carefully, "I don't want to be the reason you walk away from everything you built." "You're not," she replied. "You're the reason I stopped running." The word settled between them with quiet weight. He exhaled slowly, conflict flickering across his features. "I built a life here," he said. "It's not glamorous. It's not Manhattan. But it's stable. Lily has school. Friends. Roots." "I know," she said. "And I can't uproot her again." The sentence was protective, firm, a father drawing a boundary. Charlotte respected it immediately. "I wouldn't ask you to," she said. Silence stretched gently between them, not hostile but thoughtful. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying we don't have to choose between cities," she replied. "Whitmore Biotech can operate from anywhere. I've already started restructuring. Regional offices. Remote oversight. I can split my time." Daniel studied her carefully. "That's not small." "No," she agreed. "It's not." The wind brushed lightly through her hair, softer now that winter had passed. "I spent 20 years choosing fear," she said. "I'm not going to let geography choose for me now." Daniel stepped closer, his voice lowering. "And what about us?" There it was. The real confrontation. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't know what us looks like yet. I just know it feels honest." He laughed quietly under his breath. "Honest isn't always easy." "I'm done with easy," she replied. The tension between them shifted, not dramatic, not explosive, but steady and undeniable. "I was angry with you for so long," Daniel admitted. "I built a version of you in my head that made it easier to carry that anger." "And now?" she asked softly. "Now I see you," he said. "Not the girl who left. Not the CEO on magazine covers. Just you." Her breath caught slightly. "And do you still hate me?" she asked. He stepped closer until only inches separated them. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." The simplicity of the answer held more weight than any declaration. Inside the school, Lily's laughter echoed faintly through open doors. Daniel glanced back briefly before returning his attention to Charlotte. "If we try this," he said carefully, "it has to be steady. No headlines. No drama. Just real." She nodded. "Real is all I want." He studied her one last time, searching for hesitation. Finding none. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for her hand. Not rushed. Not reckless. Intentional. She intertwined her fingers with his, grounding herself in the warmth of his calloused palm, a stark contrast to the cold steel of corporate life she had grown used to. "This won't fix everything," he warned gently. "I know," she replied. "But it doesn't have to." For the first time, their closeness wasn't defined by fire, courtrooms, or guilt. It was defined by choice. And as they stood beneath the dim Ohio sky, two adults shaped by loss but no longer ruled by it, Charlotte realized something profound. Justice had reopened the past. But love was building something forward. And forward, for the first time, did not scare her. They had faced the fire together. Now they had to decide if they were brave enough to build something that wouldn't burn. The same photograph that once carried accusation now rested in a home that no longer smelled of smoke. 1 year later, Valentine's Day arrived without spectacle. No private dining suites. No curated optics. No hired strangers. Instead, Charlotte stood barefoot in a quiet kitchen in Ohio just after sunrise, sunlight spilling softly across hardwood floors Daniel had refinished himself that fall. The house wasn't large, but it held something her Manhattan penthouse never had, lived in warmth. The scent of coffee and cinnamon drifted through the air, mingling with the faint chill that still clung to early February mornings. On the mantel in the living room sat two framed photographs. The first was the old one, the rusted playground, scraped knees, crooked smiles. It no longer felt like evidence. It felt like origin. Beside it was a newer photograph taken just weeks earlier, Daniel standing in the snow with Lily balanced on his hip, Charlotte beside them laughing mid-sentence, her hair caught in the wind. No posed perfection. Just motion. Just life. Charlotte traced her fingers lightly along the edge of the frame before stepping back. She had not stepped away from Whitmore Biotech entirely. Instead, she had rebuilt its structure. The board had voted her in as executive chair, allowing her to divide her time between Ohio and New York. The Burn Recovery Initiative had expanded nationally, partially inspired by the publicity her testimony generated. Survivors wrote letters weekly, not thanking her for her wealth, but for her honesty. For the first time in her career, success felt aligned with integrity. Behind her, she heard the familiar rhythm of Daniel's boots crossing the hallway. "You're up early," he said softly. She turned, smiling faintly. "Couldn't sleep." He stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her waist with quiet familiarity. The gesture was natural now, not hesitant, not charged, simply rooted. "Bad dreams?" he asked. She considered the question. "No," she said. "Just old memories. They don't scare me anymore." He nodded, understanding the difference. Upstairs, Lily's footsteps thudded lightly against the floor, followed by the creak of a bedroom door opening. "Is it Valentine's Day?" Lily called down excitedly. Daniel laughed. "It is." "And you didn't hire anyone this time?" she asked mischievously. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "No," she replied warmly. "This year, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Lily bounded down the stairs, rabbit still tucked under one arm, hair wild from sleep. She handed Daniel a handmade card covered in glitter and construction paper hearts. "For you," she announced proudly. "Because you stayed." Daniel swallowed slightly, kneeling to hug her tightly. "That's my favorite gift," he murmured. Charlotte watched the exchange quietly, something deep inside her settling in a way it never had before. Stayed. The word carried more meaning than Lily intended. Daniel rose and walked toward Charlotte, holding out a second card. "She made one for you too." Charlotte accepted it carefully. Inside, in uneven handwriting, Lily had written, "Thank you for telling the truth." Charlotte blinked back sudden warmth behind her eyes. "I wasn't very brave back then," she said softly. Daniel stepped closer. You were a child. And now? She asked. He looked at her steadily. Now you're someone my daughter can look up to. The words landed deeper than any corporate award she had ever received. Later that afternoon, the three of them drove past the old empty lot. Construction had begun, a small foundation being laid for a new home funded anonymously through one of Charlotte's community grants. Not as penance. Not as publicity. As continuation. Lily pressed her face against the car window. It won't burn, she said confidently. Charlotte glanced at Daniel, a quiet understanding passing between them. No, he agreed gently. It won't. That evening, after Lily fell asleep curled on the couch during a movie, Charlotte and Daniel sat side by side on the porch swing he had built the previous spring. The wood creaked softly beneath their weight. The sky above stretched wide and clear, scattered with stars Manhattan rarely allowed her to see. You know, Daniel said thoughtfully, if you hadn't hired that fake Valentine's date last year. She smiled faintly. You would have still walked in. He considered it, then nodded. Yeah. I would have. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the steady rise and fall of his breathing grounding her in the present. I thought that night was going to ruin everything, she admitted quietly. It kind of did, he said gently. She lifted her head, mock offense flickering briefly across her face. He smiled. It ruined the lie. She exhaled softly. He was right. The fire had shaped them. The silence had divided them. The truth had unsettled everything she thought was stable. But what replaced it felt stronger. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just steady. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old playground photograph, the original, slightly faded at the edges now. I've carried this for years, he said. As proof of what we lost. He looked at her carefully before continuing. I think it's time it means something else. He handed it to her. She studied the image once more, two children unaware of the storm coming. For years, it had symbolized guilt. Abandonment. Division. Now it felt different. It felt like survival. Charlotte stood, walking to the small table near the porch door where a new frame rested. She slipped the old photograph inside and carried it back to the mantel, placing it beside the newer one. Side by side. Past and present. Daniel joined her inside, his hand finding hers naturally. You lost a Valentine's date, he teased quietly. She smiled up at him, warmth steady in her chest. No, she said softly. I found the one I owed the truth to. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering gently against her cheek. Outside, the wind moved calmly through the trees. No sirens. No smoke. No shouting. Just quiet. Charlotte looked once more at the framed photographs, the girl who chose fear, and the woman who chose courage. The circle had closed. Not perfectly. Not without scars. But honestly. And as Daniel laced his fingers through hers, she understood something she had spent 20 years chasing without realizing it. Redemption wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about refusing to let it write you forever. He walked into her life holding a photograph of who she used to be. He stayed because she finally became who she was meant to be.